Good morning, Regents. If you are with us, please turn your cameras on so we can do a roll call. We are convening this workshop of the Board of Regents of Del Mar College at 9 a.m. on Tuesday, February 9th. Due to our ongoing COVID-19 pandemic and the precautions, we are doing this meeting both virtually and with a few of us here in the License boardroom. I'm going to call roll, please. Regent Adami.
Here.
Thank you. Regent Averett.
Here.
Regent Bennett.
Here.
Regent Garza.
Here.
Regent Hutchison.
Here.
Regent Turner.
Here.
And I'm Carol Scott. We have a quorum and can conduct business. Thank you all very much for being here. If you would please join me in a moment of silence. Thank you very much. Regents, if you don't mind keeping your mics muted until you are prepared to say something, and that way I'll keep an eye out for when someone unmutes their mic to make sure that we call on folks. Would you please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And please join me in reading our Del Mar College vision statement. Del Mar College will be the premier choice for life-changing educational opportunities provided by responsive, innovative faculty and staff who empower students to improve local and global communities. Del Mar College is streaming our live audio and video from the official Board of Regents meeting on the college's website in real time, with the exception of portions of the meeting as may be considered closed session by statute. We offer an opportunity for the public to provide comments on any of our agenda items in this workshop, and we did not have any public comments this morning.
Correct, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Dr. Escamilla. Regents, we're going to jump right into our workshop topics this morning. As you recall, and we'll hear a little bit of history for the benefit of Dr. Turner and Mr. Garza on our fiscal year 2021 policy project. We have worked on policies for the last year and are bringing to fruition and bringing some draft language in workshop this morning for staff to receive feedback, and we will have official action items on our March agenda related to several of these policies based on the feedback that we have today. So with that, I'm going to turn it directly over to Ms. McDonald and ask her to introduce our consultants as well as, again, give us some background on the topic today. Ms. McDonald.
Yes. Thank you, Chair Scott. Good morning, Regents. Today, conducting the workshop with me is Dan Graves with Weaver, and we will be working on this workshop together, and we will also be going back and forth between presentation and, as the chair mentioned, some policy draft documents. So we will try to be as efficient with moving back and forth with the help of our great IT staff. So with that said, I think, Dan, if you don't mind, I'll go ahead and move forward, because I think the first few sections, I'm going to provide that history and timeline for the benefit of our new regents. So we can go ahead and go to the next slide. Okay, our topics today will be the history and timeline, which I will cover, and then Dan Graves will take over from there and do scope and objectives, recap, policy updates, compliance evaluation, additional procedures, and the next steps. Next slide, please. Okay, we began this policy project a good while back as far as prepping for it, but I wanted to go over some history. This policy project is a very important body of work. The primary way for the board to govern the college is by policy through the CEO and through budget. So in October, November of 2019, the draft policy was brought to the board, and it was a draft a new policy, B3.16, and I call it a policy on policy. And that was reviewed in October. It was reviewed by the board in November of 2019. And at that time, the board decided to keep it as a draft working document as we move forward into the project phase. Administration was scheduled to conduct a review of the manual on policies for FY21, which we are in right now. And part of this project is our policies. Do we have policies in place to comply with federal, state, and our accrediting bodies? And the administration is also working with Dan and his team from Weaver about the policy structure, the manual structure, policy format, the placement, make it a little more user-friendly, I guess you could say. And then a schedule for policy to come to the board for review on a more formal basis. And then in January of 2020 through August of 2020, staff performed some prep work for this project, and then we also engaged Weaver to assist with the project. Next slide, please. And then FY21 project timeline. In September, DEMAR staff conducted a board policy workshop, and that was to basically get some information from the board on what was their objectives, their expected outcomes for the policy project. And then October of 2020, Weaver conducted policy workshop number 2, and based on the outcomes and the feedback from that workshop is where we are today. So the next steps is our workshop for February that we're conducting right now. And then we will use that information to move forward, and we anticipate having in the March meeting as an outcome from this workshop, bringing forward some policy based on today's outcome. So it could be draft for action, it could be some more drafts, whatever the board asks us to do, but we do anticipate bringing something to you in March. And then between February and August of 2021, staff will continue to work on policy actions as needed and bring them to the board as needed. Staff will work with Weaver to finalize the policy manual, restructuring the chapters and what content goes into those chapters. And staff will complete the policy project with requested policy updates and the manual restructure we anticipate by the end of this FY21, which will be the end of August. And I believe I will go to the next slide and turn this over to Dan. Thank you.
Thank you, Tammy. Good morning, Regents. As part of our project and as part of just getting the workshop started today, I did want to go over just a recap of the scope and objectives as a refresher, because it's been a little bit since we've last met, and just for some of the newer Regents. The scope of our project here, as the college's internal auditor, we're working under our consulting standards to be able to assist the college in actually drafting some language that the college will then need to take, own, accept, and implement. So that's where we draw the line is in our consulting standards, is we can provide and recommend and actually do a lot of the legwork, but at that point, then we give it to you and you have to own it. That way we can audit it later, should we need to, and it be in our audit plan. So as part of our scope focused on the board's B policies, and we were really looking at compliance with federal, state, and accreditation standards, as well as best practice within the Texas Community College frameworks. Our objectives, we were really looking to make sure that and recommend any changes that would better align with compliance requirements or best practices. Also, there were several specific questions the board asked us to look into, so we provided input on those policy priorities. As part of the work that we will continue to do is assign policy owners to those policies to be responsible for owning, updating, and making recommendations for changes back to the board, along with a schedule of when that update and review would occur, as well as some structure that Tammy just mentioned about just a reorganization and the board's overall policy or role in that policy review. So those were the objectives and scope of our work. And I think probably for workflow and presentation just of the workshop this morning, being in an all virtual environment, and Regents, you can change this if you like, because this is your workshop and I want this to be as beneficial for you as possible. I think it would be helpful if you'll go to the next slide, please, that we just sort of review the policy priorities and the questions and recommendations. And we'll go through those first in this PowerPoint presentation. And then we will look at the draft policies. They'll be in the same order, but just from a flow to keep from having to jump back and forth between documents on the screen. I think that might work a little bit better. However, if you have any questions or want to look at specific segments of those policies, I'm happy to do that for you. Please just let me know, interrupt me, whatever you need to do so that this can be helpful for you. I'm here for you, so just let me know how I can serve you best. So as a refresher on those questions from the policy priorities, one of the first was under ethical considerations. And the question was really about if there's a concern with an ethics violation of another board member, who do Regents go to? And the short answer is you really did have in your policy, existing policy, some good practices. The board member should go to the board chair with any ethical concerns that relate to board business. If that business does involve the board chair, the vice chair could be consulted. And one of the things that always like to remind people is you do have a general counsel for ethics questions and guidance, and he can provide that guidance within the framework and in the scope of board business. And so that is always a resource for Regents to consult with the general counsel on any ethics questions that they might have. And we've drafted some policies with some specific language for you in these areas that we'll go over here in just a minute. So if you'll go to the next slide, please. So these templates that we've drafted provide added additional definitions under the current statement of ethics. So you do have a statement of ethics, that's your B212 policy. These different policies over ethical standards, regent misconduct, prohibited actions, and then all the definitions would fit within that framework. So below the statement of ethics as further clarifiers and definers. So as we look through the detailed language, you'll understand how that fits in. Next slide, please. One of the other areas was under emergency and crisis policies. There were two questions about, are the existing policies adequate? And then what powers and responsibilities are delegated to the CEO in a time of emergency? And so our recommendations included expanding some criteria to designate exactly what an emergency is, update those policies to explicitly provide CEO authorities, and then there's a little bit of reorganization expanding on some of the broader range of emergency considerations. Next slide, please. So in response to that, we did draft a CEO emergency authority policy, a policy for emergency procedures, and then again, some definitions to further provide clarity over what the terms used in the various policies are. One thing I should add is I say we drafted, that might be a little bit bold of a statement. What we did is we did go through and compare existing policies, procedures across the majority of Texas community colleges, and we actually leveraged and pulled information from those various policies, and we're able to leverage those in the assistance of drafting. So if you remember back from our prior presentation, there's a total of 50 Texas community colleges, and approximately 39 of those use the existing policies drafted by the TASB Association, and then 11 of those are independently drafted. And so we compared to that full data set of policies to find sort of what we thought was best of breed to bring those to you as part of recommendations for the policies that we're sharing today. The next policy priority, if you go to the next slide, please. That question was about digital policies and requirements for board members and digital communications. There were a couple policies that we identified to be included. Some of those are around security standards on college devices and security awareness, and overall a recommendation to provide that Del Mar Regents use exclusively Del Mar College email addresses for digital communication to help protect the Regents and to help also in the event of a public information request to help provide in compliance with the expedient processing of those. As far as protecting Regents, it prevents the ability, if you solely conduct business on a Del Mar College email, then a personal email will not be subject to a PIA request search. So if you go to the next slide, please. In response to these, we've provided drafts of a Regent email and official communications policy, and then also a social media policy regarding posting on sites for Regents. There will be additional policies for college employees and student groups that the college will work on. The ones we are presenting today are solely for the governance of the Regents and activities within the Del Mar board. Go to the next slide, please. Board committee and structure was another area with a question on establishment of committees. We identified that current bylaws actually provide the establishment of committees as needed, and that the chair is able to appoint committee members in terms of each committee. What we also identified is that the board may consider making some updates to the existing bylaws. Those include adopting a resolution in even numbered years. So having the explicit activity of determining how the board will operate basically once every 2 years in an election cycle, so that it's an explicit and overt action of the board, but then also allow provisions for at any time during a board session or the existence of the board that a committee could be established. So if you go to the next slide, please. So we provided updates on the current bylaws for the board committees and updates on how to form the committees. And we've provided those. You'll see those in the draft today. Next slide, please. One of the next areas was, or the last area was around policy updates and information requests on how Regents request information and the processing of that information and those best practices. The current policy of the B213, we went over last time, actually has the best practices, that those requests are submitted to the CEO and that all information is then distributed to all board members once it's produced. The one update that we did recommend was to establish within policy some provisions that would allow the CEO to bring back to the board if the request and the ability to provide the information from that request is complicated, takes a lot of time, or is very expensive for the college to do, and it allows the CEO to bring that back to the board for the board in its entirety to make a decision on whether or not that time is best utilized providing that information or foregoing that effort to accumulate and produce that information. So if you go to the next slide, we did provide a policy template for you to consider as far as how college records and documents, it's an edit on your existing policy that we've recommended for you to consider. So with that, if you could switch over to the proposed policy revisions, starting with the ethics section of ethical standards, we have provided this policy in its draft state. So you'll see in the key at the top that any black text as it exists means that is a current policy, and any blue text is a revision that we have either added or recommended for you to consider and I say it that way very carefully, is that these are just our recommendations, again, from the comparison of all the Texas community colleges to bring you what we thought was best of breed and that addresses the issues that you brought as a concern. So these are what we have found and are recommending for you to take, consider, review, and then provide myself and the college administration some instruction on how you'd like to see these edited or changed. So I'm going to ask Chair Scott, would you like for me to go over these policies? I think hopefully the regents have had a chance to look at and review and ask questions, but wanted to, I don't feel like I should read them to you. Just wanted to open up for questions, or if you'd like for me to provide a summary of each section, I could do that as well.
Thank you very much, Dan. So I think what I'd like to do is make sure that as we go through each section that we have a chance for regent comments or questions. So specifically related to this first section on ethical considerations, do we, one, think it captures the direction from our previous workshops, and two, is there any specific language that a regent would like to discuss, amend, affirm? So there's an opening there kind of after each major section for us to have a discussion. Is there any feedback from regents? Ms. Abert?
Thank you. I did have a question, but frankly, I'm not sure if it's in this first section since I'm only seeing a couple of paragraphs. So you're just asking right now, Chairwoman Scott, about this. Are you talking about number one, or are you talking about everything under board member ethical considerations?
Everything under board member ethical considerations. And if there's a specific paragraph, then we can move the screen to show what you're referencing.
Okay.
So it starts with policy 1 on ethical standards, policy 2 on regent misconduct, policy 3 on prohibited actions, and then definitions. And as Dan talked about earlier, this would actually go after our statement of ethics in our existing policy. So this would provide more robust context to our existing statement of ethics.
If I remember correctly, it may have been under section 3. Then there was first let me say, Dan and Tammy, thank you so much for this. I think there's a lot of very strong language in here that is good for us, and clearly a lot of work has been done on this. So thank you for that. And yes, it is in that section 3 under prohibited actions. In the very last paragraph, it talks about how the college may not employ a former regent until the first anniversary of the date of the regent's membership on the board ends. My question is whether it would be appropriate to consider language that also would prohibit a former regent from doing business directly with the college through one of our vendors or contractors. Similar, I think, to I believe that there is some state language around, how a former state employee can't lobby, and Augie may have some more information on that. But I understand that this specifically says you can't work for the college, but would it also be possible to, and obviously we can't restrict where somebody may work, but we could restrict whether or not they have direct work through that separate company with the college.
Regent Averett, are you suggesting for the same cooling off period of 1 year? Is that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
And I just wanted to add, I think that's important because of conflict of interest and just, you get into some of those sticky fingers situations. And I think that's important that we add that. And obviously we don't have control if they really seek and get hired by a private company. But I think it's just, a safety net and just, where the direction we're going, and just instead of citing that section.
Thank you, Dr. Turner. Regent Averett, did you have anything else on that?
I don't believe so. Thank you.
Thank you. Regent Hutchison?
I just wanted to comment. I like the concept that Libby's putting forth here, and I think it is a concern. I'm interested in how the details of what is direct contact and how that would be phrased. But it's tricky to define all those things, but it's definitely a good goal.
Thank you, Regent Hutchison. And I think there probably needs to be some clarification on ownership of a business versus employment. There is, I know that they're in the existing conflict of interest law. So some of this may be covered under our state law regarding conflict of interest. And so an ownership of a company versus an employee of the company, and whether or not the employment in that company requires direct access to the Board of Regents, or are you just working for a company separately without any contact with the Board of Regents? So again, I think the clarity between General Counsel and but Mr. Graves may be able to find out in terms of some best practices or language from other community colleges to see that come back. Any other questions?
Yes.
I'm sorry,
This
Mr.
is Dan. I'd be happy to go back and look at the procurement guide from the state, as well as the other conflict of interest rules, and then bring you back a draft with something that mirrors the same lobbying guidelines that Regent Averett mentioned.
Dan, I'll work with you on that. Thanks.
Thank you, Augie.
Any other questions or comments on the ethical consideration section? Mr. Garza?
Yeah, I do. I'm in favor of us adopting something like this. I just question, I mean, if we adopt something, there's no teeth in it, then I've got a concern. Right now, these ethics policies have a stipulation that if a regent does violate an ethics rule, then there's a way that the board can sanction that board member. I mean, if there's a former board member or somebody that worked with the college that's lobbying, I mean, I don't know that there's any kind of punishment that we can derive. I know when I was serving on the board of directors of the appraisal district, I mean, there was about a 5 or 7 year, I'm going to say, cooling off period that you couldn't apply to serve on the appraisal review board, or to be able to actually lobby for folks that were trying to get their values reduced. And I don't know, again, I don't know if 1 year is enough. And again, my question is actually penalties if a former board member does violate an ethics rule. Just question.
Regent Scott?
Yes,
Yeah. Can I address Regent Gaddis's question briefly?
please.
Yes, Regent Gaddis, generally, whatever you do is prospective going forward. You wouldn't apply retroactively. And just in terms of what I want to be clear, and we're going to cover this in a bit, or we can cover it further during the board ethics update. The board has the ability to censure a board member, but beyond censure, you don't have any removal or other sanctioned authority right now under your board bylaws. I just wanted to clarify that.
Thank you, Mr. Rivera. Mr. Bennett?
Would it be possible that rather than address the board member or the former board member, that we address the company that they may have gone to work for and say, it's fine that he goes to work for them, but we cannot do business with that company for a certain period of time, like 3 years? Would that be a possibility?
Mr. Bennett, I don't believe so. I think that would be outside the board's jurisdiction, but that's my initial thought. And I don't know, Dan, I don't know whether you've seen anything like that in any of your work with other college policies, but I don't think the board's jurisdiction would extend to doing something with, or against, or with the vendor.
Mr. Rivera, I've not seen anything in another college policy that goes down that road.
Even if that were part of the contract?
That's a good question. I'll have to look at it, Mr. Bennett. My initial thought is that you wouldn't be able to do that, but I can look at that specific question.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Sure.
Anything else on this section? Good. Okay. Thank you all very much. Let's move on for a general introduction into the details around the emergency and crisis policy.
So under the emergency and crisis policies, there are the three policies that, or I guess the two that we have there are the CEO emergency authority, and this just outlines the authority that the CEO would have, as well as defining an emergency management crisis executive committee who composes that committee, and that's essentially the group of administration who collectively gets together and determines whether it is an emergency or not, and whether or not to activate those emergency policies. And then also an emergency purchases policy. The college does have some provisions within the procurement process for emergency purchases. This does provide a little bit more clear guidelines on the existence, and if you'll note, there are three highlights there that establish some thresholds. They're all thresholds for individual authority on purchasing. One directly for the CEO, below the CEO, the vice president and chief financial officer, and then another threshold that the board must ratify or approve from sole source purchases. We've intentionally left those dollar figures blank for the board to provide and give direction on what those thresholds should be, or what you think they should be. And I'll stop and open for discussion and questions.
I just wanted to call to the Regents' attention on line number 8, the sentence that starts, "The CEO must report to the board any actions taken under this subsection." So while those actions may occur, they won't occur in a complete vacuum, and that the board would receive a full accounting of any actions taken related to this crisis policy, both in terms of action as well as in purchases at a subsequent board meeting. Dr. Escamilla has a comment?
Yes. I would like to add that we've experienced this, and this has obviously come from past experiences and in the review and so forth. And as such, I just kind of want to give you some kind of practical things that we've experienced. The other thing that I would do, I would certainly bring updates to the board like I've done every month since COVID and during the hurricanes and other types of emergencies. I also want you to know that this would even happen before this would be an immediate call to at least a member of the officers, the chair, or a member, or perhaps a communication electronically to all members of the executive committee as well. So if you want to put that in there, or if that's for your consideration, those are things that I would do anyway, in addition to this. So, and prior to coming to the formal board in a formal called meeting. So just for your consideration, if you want to weave that into any of this.
I appreciate that. I don't want to be too prescriptive.
Yeah.
In the case of an emergency or crisis. It does say on line number 9 of that first paragraph, the CEO or designee should, where practical, update the board chair during the course of the emergency.
I guess that
If
would cover that.
you go forward, if you do additional work than that's great.
Yes, ma'am.
But I don't want to, again, be overly prescriptive on what happens during a crisis. That's my personal opinion. The other board members may feel something different, but.
No, I understand that, and I
Yeah.
appreciate that very much.
Other comments on this section? Dan, in terms of filling out the dollar amounts where you have it highlighted, Are you waiting for input from general counsel, or do you need specific guidance from the board today? Are there some options you want us to consider today? Dan, I think you're frozen. Tammy, can you answer that question?
Yes, Chair. We are looking for some guidance from the board, and I think also from Dr. Escamilla on his previous experience with the emergency purchases to help us fill in those thresholds. So we are looking for input from the board and from Dr. Escamilla on those thresholds. And then, of course, if he needs some input from our CFO, we could take that too.
Okay.
I'm back now. I apologize. Everything froze for just a second. So, could you repeat your question? I'm sorry.
Sure. We were talking about the highlighted areas where you're looking for a threshold for authorization of purchases under policy emergency purchases. And Tammy explained to us that we are waiting for some feedback from both Dr. Escamilla and our CFO on what they feel would be the appropriate number. I just wanted to call that to the board's attention to see. Our current threshold is 50,000, correct, Dr. Escamilla?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
And the number under emergency circumstances would be substantially higher because of the nature of where we live and so forth. Hurricanes being and pandemics, I guess now, would be the prime examples. Hurricanes being the ones that have been repeated themselves more so. And in cases like that, my biggest consideration is, as an example for everyone's first consideration, and I have talked to Tammy, and I think Dan about this too, is what we want for your consideration today is an understanding that when insurance deductibles are really the basis, kind of the give the parameters for these numbers. That's why they're in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. And so when you think about what our insurance deductibles are for the college, those are the quickest things we want to be able to invoke. And then there are other associated costs, things that are outside deductibles and those sorts of things. When we're talking about the feds, they give us, you never know what kind of thresholds and percentages they're giving us, but it's a substantial amount of money. So I put that out there. Tammy, yeah, there you go. Tammy's already prompted with that one because we've already talked about that. So she's ready to go on that response.
Well, Dr. Esby, if I may add, it's very important about our deductibles, but with any claim, let's say it is it's a wind event, it is a named storm, or it could be, we've had fire and flood events in the last so many years. It's not just the deductible. We have to pay up front to get things repaired. The insurance company doesn't come in and give us money up front. So many times, we have to move quickly to get some things repaired because it is for safety and security concerns. So we have to pay, and most times and not, over our deductible. We have to pay those claims and then get reimbursed the amount that our insurance company will reimburse us minus our deductible. Yeah. So if it's a regular event, let's say it's a fire or something of that sort, it's $100,000 per event. But if it's a named storm, then it's up to $2.5 million catastrophic. So that's the very wide range of what our deductibles could be. But like I said, we most time have to upfront the money and then wait on reimbursement.
Yeah, that was what I was referring to as other items beyond the deductibles. So I think I was trying to say that, but thank you for that.
Yes, Dr. Turner?
How much is in the risk reserves currently? Did I say that right?
Yeah, the risk reserve.
Reserves, right? There we go, yes. How much is currently in there? Because the
risk reserve fund is a little over $8 million.
Okay.
I want to say 8.3. I don't have the exact number, but it's like 8.3 or 8.4.
Okay. Thank you.
So I guess the purpose of this policy is, what do you need short-term authorization for inside 30 or 45 days, depending on the time frame that it happens. We could have a special called meeting if there needs to be something over that amount. But when we're talking about insurance claims, there's the immediate inside 30 days, to shore things up, to keep further damage from happening. And then there's long-term claim kinds of issues that the board would then be able to be briefed on in full and give you authorization. So there's a balance, I think, between what is considered this short-term emergency response kind of scenario and what kind of purchases need to be authorized versus long-term. So I'm going to let y'all continue to work that issue and come back to us with a specific number.
Sure.
Based on kind of your best scenarios. But again, this is not assuming that the board would never be able to meet inside a 6-month period. We would find a way to meet inside a crisis to give you authorization to spend more if you needed to.
No, absolutely. I can tell you that the round numbers that Tammy and I, just to begin putting an actual number out there, was $500,000. That's why we put that. I'd suggested that as a point for consideration.
Any other questions or comments related to this emergency crisis policy? All right, thank you all. So we'll move on to the board member digital policy and communications.
So under the digital policy and communications, there were two policies that we provided. One regarding using the Del Mar College email as the official communication, and then another for guidance on posting on social media and the use of college intellectual property such as logos and other information as part of those posts. So any questions, comments, edits?
So I think it's important to bring to the board's attention on number 7, kind of a social media policy. And this is one that we may want to think about some and make sure that we are balancing free speech and the fact that we are all representative of the voters and constituents in our districts and at large. And so I like the fact that they're starting with it. We're encouraged to share information that's a matter of public record. But I think there does need to be some caveats there and some guidance for regents in terms of what happens on personal sites. The other piece at the very bottom, starting with line 26, the use of the logo, mascot, nickname, etc., the trademark materials around political parties or candidacies. Certainly, if you're a Del Mar candidate or candidate for regent, then you can use the name, but to be appropriate in the use of the logo, mascot, and other trademark pieces would be important. So I think we need to make sure we all understand and are ready to affirm that social media policy. Are there questions or comments regarding this digital policy? Regent Averett?
Thank you. Again, it's good to see these proposals. I think we definitely need something like this. A couple of questions that I have. One, I wonder if it is worth restating somewhere in here the importance of keeping discussions that are had in closed session private and being careful not to inadvertently give away some of that information that is supposed to be kept confidential. And also I believe, and I'm sorry that I don't remember exactly where it is, but I believe that in some of our, either the ethics policy or I just don't remember where it is, but I think that there's some language around remembering that we operate as a whole, and while we may not always agree with actions that are taken, it is important for us to carry out what the majority wants us to do. And so, again, I don't want to restrict peace and people's ability to give their opinion. At the same time, I want to make sure that we are in compliance with other parts of our policies or codes that emphasize the need for us to act as a whole.
Thank you, Regent Averett. I think there in the ethical considerations, there was a notation in there about the disclosure of information from closed session, and that could be considered official misconduct or abuse of office. I think that's where I read that. Tammy, Dan, do I recall that correctly?
Yes, I'm looking for it right now, but yes, ma'am, if it's not there, it is in policy, and I believe you also have a reference in your bylaws, but I will double check that for you.
The
for the
ethical, I think
reference.
it's in the ethical standards from the earlier, where regents must restrain strict confidentiality of information that's presented during a board meeting proprietary to the college and not within the college domain. Any regent's disclosure or misuse of this information may be considered official misconduct or abuse of office. So that part of your question, I think, is restated in that section, and whether or not we restate it here is I think up for our direction to Tammy and to Dan.
Yes, ma'am, so that would be on the policy draft 1, starting with line 13.
Does that answer
And Regent Scott, it is also in your board bylaws. And I want everybody to remember here, there is a distinction between your board bylaws and college policy. Now, of course, they have to be harmonized, and we'll talk about that a little later this morning, but it's under J of your statement of ethics. Respect the confidentiality of information that is privileged under applicable law, including all deliberations of the board in closed sessions.
Okay.
So Chair Scott, to your point, I would not recommend re-including it. I could stand by a reference back to the ethics section, but I would not re-include or retype the same verbiage in the section. I would not recommend that, just from a policy maintenance standpoint.
All right. Thank you. Regent Hutchison?
Yeah, I basically want to say, I think what Dan just said, which is I'm concerned. I would hope that the confidentiality and all of those other issues would be overriding all of these policies, and I'd be concerned about putting something that may contradict. But I think it would be helpful to have a reference in there, consistent with or in abeyance with confidentiality and other ethical considerations, something like that, without restating them. That seems to me to be helpful.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments on this section on digital policy and communications? All right, let's move on to board structure and policies.
So under board structure and policies, if the person controlling the screen would actually go to the bylaws, the proposed bylaw revisions. So this is where, yes. So this is your current set of bylaws. Under your bylaws, the one thing we did recommend was just some updates to the resolution for reviewing the board composition and operational structure, and then also the creation of committees. And so based on the instructions from the last workshop, we provided these edits, and you'll see in the black all the line through version. This is in current bylaw whereby the board has enumerated and specifically called out different committees. It didn't limit the board to these committees, but it did specify and give some examples of committees under the direction of the board. From our last workshop, we did or have proposed the strike through or removal of those specific identification of committees, and just recommended the establishment. If you go to the next page, please. Lines 19 through 34 are the additions that talk about the process of an even numbered years, the board making a cognizant decision on how to operate, whether a committee of the whole or established committees. as well as how committee members are appointed, their terms, and then the operation of those committees being less than a quorum of the board, and some detail on if more than one, if a number of board members attends the committee meeting and establishes a quorum, just a reminder that the board is subject to the Open Meetings Act at that point.
Thank you for this, Dan. Are there questions or comments related to this change? We had discussed at our workshop session, and since then, the desire of the board to establish an audit committee. So at the adoption of this language, hopefully at our March board meeting, I'll also bring forth an action item to establish that audit committee for the remainder of the biennium that we're currently under. So if the board is comfortable with that, wanted to bring that up during this workshop session, that would be a future agenda item as well, and be prepared for that. If there's other committees that the board wants to consider, we can have that discussion as well. But wanted to we're doing this in trying to do it in a methodical fashion, which means it's a little bit slower than I wanted in terms of response to that request, but getting the policies right first before we establish the committees, I think, is important. Anything else on this item? Okay, Dan. Well, we'll go on to the next item, which is the board request for information.
Yes, briefly before we do jump to that item, if you will go back to the policy draft document there on page 4 and line 31, there is a policy that briefly just refers the reader of the policy back to the bylaws for the establishment of committees. So just as a note for the rest of the regents. So then moving on to the information requests, the policies that we have, or the one policy draft is actually an edit on the current policy. So they've already pulled it up on the screen there for you. This is just a subsection of the existing policy that provides the process by which the CEO may come back. We did add, we had some questions and some discussion on whether or not some thresholds should be established. We've had quite a bit of discussion. I've consulted, and Augie and I have talked, and I've talked with Tammy, and rather than set a threshold that frankly would be just an arbitrary threshold, there's no guidance in any statute that provides a hard and fast threshold. And largely most policies leave it up to CEO discretion. We've included in here that the CEO may, as in consultation with the board chair, present a request back to the board with an estimated cost for then the Board of Regents to decide on whether or not an information request should be filled if it's deemed or considered by the CEO and the board chair to be time consuming or costly for the college to produce. So that is the one edit and recommendation that we've made in regards to the existing information request policy.
Thank you. Regent Averitt, you have a question?
I do, thank you. I've never made such a request, but I am assuming currently what happens is the request happens, it's fulfilled, and there is no charge. And I understand we're not suggesting that we charge the regents for this information. My question is, though, if we adopt this and if the request is estimated to cost quite a bit and be very time consuming, and the board says, no, we shouldn't fill it, wouldn't the regent as a private citizen still have the right to file an open records request and get the information if they're willing to pay for it? Because I certainly don't want us to do anything that restricts what is public information.
I can provide you my thoughts on that, but it's probably best to let Mr. Rivera answer that one.
Yeah, if I understand the question, Regent Averett, so the general rule is if any of you as a regent believes that you need information in order for you to carry out your duty as a regent, then you are entitled to request that information. If it's a legitimate request, let me say this. I think it's probably also true that if the request is getting too expensive, that it's probably not information that you need. I mean, I'm just suggesting that if you're asking for something that's going to be cost prohibitive, then it's probably outside the realm of what you need to be able to do your job. I'm sure that there may be exceptions, but that's the general rule. So the threshold question is this something that fits within what you need to do your job as a regent? If it's not, you can always, an individual can always ask for information as a private citizen. Does that answer your question?
It does, as long as that, we're not trying to restrict that avenue. Obviously the public information laws don't say, it's not public if it costs too much or if it's too time consuming. So as long as we as individuals, not in our capacity as regents, could still request that information and pay for it if we're so inclined.
That's exactly right. Mr. Graves and I talked about that, and that's, that this is not intended to curtail your right to request information as a private citizen.
So is there a way we can maybe change some of the language so that, if a board member seeks information so that they can make decisions and it's within college business, they might need to maybe have something in there because, what's the cost? So what does it become costly? Is there a magical number that determines that so you might need to, and what's time consumed? Is that an hour, 3 minutes? So you might need to put a little bit more parameters on there or, because your interpretation is going to be different than mine.
Regent Turner, that's exactly the problem we had. I think Mr. Graves and I didn't feel comfortable arbitrarily putting numbers in there because you're right. It's almost something where you have to say it'll be determined on a case-by-case basis.
But who determines that?
The board. So this is saying that if a
It ultimately comes back to the board, right? Yes.
correct.
That's right.
Correct.
So the way I read this from a practical standpoint is if the request, if the information requested by an individual board member is of concern to the CEO, he or she would come to the board chair and say, preparing the response to this information request is not something that currently exists. It's not a report that's already available. It's not a quick run of something that can be programmed and run quickly. It's going to require the staff to do some digging to create this report, to respond to this request. And so then that is put on an agenda for the subsequent board meeting, and the board as a whole hears the information request and determines if the board as a whole wants to authorize staff to spend the time and resources necessary to do that, to accomplish that task. So upon vote, if the request is approved by the board, the request will be filled. So that's what that language in line 21 and 22, I think, say. But I think that just gives the CEO some protection. And we all heard of the University of Texas Regent issue several years back with the voluminous public information or information requests. And so I think this is where that kind of protection comes from. But all the previous parts of the policy in black show that if there's information or reports or proposals or history on an issue of information that's already established, the board member certainly can request that because all of that's in the public domain. And as opposed to the regent having to go back through previous agendas to pull out these issues, staff can do that quickly because it's already information that is out there in the public domain. So from a practical standpoint, that's kind of how I potentially see it working. It is not specific and directive on purpose because, again, is 3 hours too much? Is 10 hours too much? Is 30 minutes too much? There would be an arbitrary number that staff would be proposing. If the board wants to propose a number, we could certainly do that. Mr. Bennett, you have your mic open for a question or comment.
I do. Would the board have that discussion in open session?
I think it depends on the nature of the request. If there is nothing in that request that would be considered proprietary or have any sort of legal consequences, I think it could take place in open session. I'd have to ask Augie for his opinion on what may or may not constitute closed session language in that regard.
Thank you.
That's right. You're correct. You're correct, Regent Scott.
I'm sorry, if I may add to that very quickly, Mr. Rivera, aren't public information requests public documents? And if so, I would suggest that if we do have this discussion, we should do it in an open session.
I think the question was, the documents, you can, as regents, request documents that are confidential. But as a private citizen would not be entitled to that same information under the Public Information Act.
Okay, thank you for that clarification.
Sure. I think what Regent Scott was saying is that if what the material that is being sought is confidential, we may have to have that discussion in closed session.
I would like to add one other detail into the summary that Chair Scott gave on the process. When the CEO and the board chair do bring the request back to the board for a decision, there's also a cost estimate that would be provided at that time as well. And the method by which that cost estimate is developed is the standardized method from the Office of the Attorney General. So that's just one minor detail that I think is important that would allow the board to then make some determination on whether or not that the board as a whole believed that request was time consuming or costly. So hopefully Regent Turner, that helps a little bit with that clarification on that decision.
Thank you, Dan. Regent Hutcherson, I saw that you had your mic open.
I did. I just want to add the comment that I don't see this just as a protection of the CEO. I see this as a protection for the college and the administration and getting things done. I wouldn't want it to just keep one individual safe, but I think it's important to keep the operation of the college going, and that's where we would ultimately make a determination if that's happening or not.
Thank you. And from my perspective as board chair, I don't see this as an overly burdensome threshold that is, or an obstacle that is intended to keep regents from getting information. What I see it as is the board as a whole agreeing that that's a priority for our staff to do this research. If it's an issue that is that time consuming and that important, as a board, we should direct the staff based on a board decision, not based on an individual regent request. And so to me, this is about the board working together as a whole and understanding that if there is a need for information to make a decision or to provide strategic direction for the staff, then that needs to be a board discussion, not an individual board decision. So I really see this as the board as a whole being participatory in those kinds of discussions. Anything else on this agenda item? Or excuse me, on this policy item? So next we would move on to number 10, which is the policy authority and review.
Well, Chair Scott, if we could go back to the PowerPoint, I've got a couple things before we jump into the remainder. So those were the policy priority questions. The other charge that we were given was part of a compliance evaluation. We have completed our compliance evaluation, and we did not identify any issues where there were compliance issues that we have not already provided as part of an internal audit. You know, if you remember back when we looked at policies, part of some of our human resources, we had some recommendations for some policies to be updated in accordance with some of the guidelines. We also, we looked for the compliance with federal, state, and then the SAC COC guidance. So that part of our evaluation is complete. However, if you go to the next slide, through that evaluation, we did identify a few things where some existing policies might need to be clarified or to have some alignment with best practices. And so we do have the remainder of the policies in the document to go through related to policy and authority, which is what Ms. McDonald referred to as the policy on policies, board training, some conflicts of interest, teleconferencing and video conferencing, and some other board meetings, as well as, so through those, if you go to the next slide, we have provided those templates and some additional templates related to faculty and staff committees, debt management, enterprise risk management, emergency management, environmental health and safety, as well as telecommuting. And if you'll go to the next slide, please. We continue to look at policy compliance and organization. We're working with the college administration for those recommendations, and some of those will address internal audit findings, such as the one policy I referred to about HR, that will also improve some user friendliness, so searchability, organization, and then provide some overall strength to policies. And so those will be part of our next steps. If you go to the next slide, please. We'll continue to coordinate with administration, finalize those updates. As Tammy mentioned in her overview, we'll have those policies in March for the board to consider, but then throughout the remainder of the year, as these policies get reviewed and have input by administration, we'll present that to the board at those times. And so now if we could move back to the proposed policies.
Dan, while
there with, yes, ma'am.
While you're doing that, so I just want to clarify that we should expect as a board for the next several months or between now and the end of the year to have several different policies that come before us for adoption. Some of the revisions that you based on, they're not all going to be ready in March, I guess is what I'm referring to, that we're going to see these roll out over the next several months for adoption.
This is Tammy. Yes, ma'am, that's correct. Well, we're going to prioritize what you have mentioned in the workshop today to bring back in March, and some other ones that have the final drafts to bring those back. But then from March through August, we will be bringing policies back as they're ready. As we get moving into some of the other policy drafts on down the numbering system, you'll see that some of them right now are under review by several members of administration. So those would not be ready the next month or two. But yeah, they will come back over the course of the remainder of the fiscal year.
Thank you.
So now, if you would scroll up to the prior page. So this is policy 10, policy authority and review in a draft. This is the what Tammy referred to as the policies on policy, or the policy on policies. Most of the information in black you've already seen as a proposed policy. The blue text starting on line 37 are a few edits and refinements that we have proposed that you consider to be included. They're fairly minor overall. If you go to the next page, there's another one where we have suggested that the college add on line 10 there the last date of review or revision of the policy into the policy itself, so that a reader of the policy knows the last date that that policy has been updated. And I believe that is the majority of the edits until we get on to page 7, where it's more of the same as far as the revision. It provides the prescriptive revision date. And then the board policy review on page 7, starting on line 28, proposed an assignment of policy owner who then reviews each policy every 2 years in accordance with legislation. And then I believe it's every 5 years at the top of the next page, where that policy owner presents to the board a formal review and any revisions. And we've provided that schedule in the table below that.
I have a question here.
That is, yes.
Regarding these chapters, when you talked earlier about the reorganization of the policy document, are these chapters going to remain the same? Or I realize that chapter 1 and 2, 3, there may be several of these that remain the same, but when we have a large section on miscellaneous, for example, and so I would think a miscellaneous chapter ought to go away. You ought to be able to find a way to fit miscellaneous policies into some section of the college. And then prohibiting sexual violence and carrying of handguns, are those required by law to be separate chapters, or can those be incorporated into other sections of the policy document?
As far as the miscellaneous, yes, I do believe we would be able to find some. A lot of what's currently in your miscellaneous, I'm looking at, I actually have it pulled up on my screen right now. There's quite frankly a lot of A policies or A procedures that are in your miscellaneous. So those would then be filed under, and most of these do relate to emergency disaster general preparedness. So that they would, I would think, once we get done looking at those, they would fall under some of the emergency other chapters. As part of the sexual violence and handguns, I will tell you that it is a matter of practice that most colleges do have those stated separately, mainly because of the focus on sexual violence, and especially by the most recent administration and revisions to some of those rules and how some of the investigations over sexual violence or sexual harassment are conducted now. And then the chapter 10 for handguns on campus by a license holder, just in reference to the concealed carry laws within the state of Texas. Most colleges do have those separated out into 2 separate sections. Tammy may want to comment on that though.
Yes, that was a best practice when we implemented those policies years ago. That was a best practice, is to have them stand out so that people did not have to look at any particular section, because they do have to do with employees, students, and visitors. So rather than trying to go to those different chapters, it was best practice to leave them as standalone. But yes, ma'am, we will, more likely we will not have a miscellaneous section any longer. And that's something that we're working with Dan on, the restructuring, and it could be relabeling of the chapters. But I think for the purpose of this policy, it's just, we will provide you with a formal schedule, and then we can always go in and edit the chapter names as we go.
So I appreciate that this was for illustration, that on a 5-year review schedule, we would take a couple of chapters each year. I just, in looking at the miscellaneous is the one that really stuck out to me, that I thought that's a really interesting, certainly we could figure out where miscellaneous policies go into one of the previous 7 categories. So I'll let you continue, Dan.
Thank you. So the next policy, or I guess, are there any other comments on policy 10? All right, I see none, so I'm going to move on. Policy 11, or section 11 under board member training, covers board member orientation training, open meetings training, cybersecurity training, all those various trainings that board members and regents get to go through as part of their first introduction to the college. These are just some policies that clarify and outline a little bit more of the compliance efforts of the college to complete those trainings in accordance with government code and education code. So any questions or comments on those? All right, if there are none, I'll move to conflicts of interest. Policies 15 and 16. Again, these are just clarifications, further elaborations on existing information. Provide some really fun definitions on first degree of affinity and consens. I can't even say the word right. Consanguinity of relationship. Thank you, Augie. And how to handle conflicts of interest and abstention, and then some disclosure statements on conflicts of interest for legal and interest for the college business. So any comments or questions there? All right. If none, I'll move to the telecommuting and teleconferencing. As we're all keenly aware, since we're telecommuting and video conferencing today, just some elaboration and clarification on board policy on when that's appropriate and how it can be used for both teleconferencing and video conferencing. So any questions there? All right. None. Board meetings. This is some further elaboration on in policy that mirrors what you have in your bylaws about how minutes, agendas, locations, dates, times, provisions on the operation of the meeting, of board meetings, and how those will be conducted. These do align with what your bylaws stipulate, and then provides some definitions to clarify on the terms, what it means by closed session and what a board meeting or other technical terms within those sections, what they define and mean. So any questions there on board meetings? All right. The last section, if you go to the next page, is the additional policies. And so these are just a few clarifications, some policies that we identified as part of best practice. Next page, please. This is page 13 of the document. Thank you. So one edit to the first is really just a title edit. Under policy B 2.4, it referred to committees, cabinets, and councils. However, the content of the policy is really related to faculty and staff or non-board and administrative to the college committees, cabinets, and councils. So we proposed a clarification there. If you read through the body of that, it's clear that these are not committees and cabinets of the board, but of faculty and staff through the college. So we just thought the clarification in the title was prudent. And then the remainder of the policies, several of those, debt management. There's a current effort by the college to craft a debt management policy that would allow the college to be eligible for the Distinguished Budget Presentation Award Program from the Government Finance Officials Association, the GFOA. There's several awards for reporting and budgeting that are provided by the GFOA to be a recognized entity. Having a policy over debt management is one of those. It's also a best practice, and through our comparison, we identified several colleges that have explicit debt management policies. So we've provided this one, and it's currently being reviewed by the CFO and will be tailored. And I believe, Tammy, the section of these policies are all under review by college administration to then be further edited and provided back to the board. Is that correct?
Yes, for all the remainder policies, basically I'm looking at them as a placeholder. These are suggested policies as best practices that have been recommended to implement some type of policy. So I'm viewing these policies as placeholders. They're all under review by different vice presidents and the different administration within the college that was sent out to them. So they could come back to the board for approval. They may not come back for approval if we decide that we have a policy that might fit somewhere else. They could come back looking quite differently, or they could look the same. It's just we wanted you to be aware that we are looking at the recommendations from Weaver on best practice policies, and that we have a placeholder for them, and administration is reviewing all of them, and they will come back to you with administration's recommendation in the future.
Thank you.
If you have any questions at this time on any of them, we'll be happy to entertain those questions.
There's one item in particular on the very last page. You'll see a highlight on row 30 or line 30 of the last page, and that is a reference that will be a reference to an existing policy, like an employee handbook type policy that stipulates eligibility for telecommuting for faculty and staff. But that is the only current highlight in that section that would need to be filled in, just so you're aware of what that is in reference.
Right.
To be
Excuse me, Dan. Right, and like I said, just to be clear, because we do have not just administration review, but some of the policies will definitely go through our shared governance. So that's why today's a placeholder and it's a draft and it's a suggestion. So we do have a process we will follow. And especially over the last year, since we have had quite a bit of remote work because of our pandemic situation, we felt like it was time for us to move forward something with remote work or telecommuting. So that's why, of course, that one's there too.
Any questions, comments about any of those policies from page 13 there through the end?
So Dan, does that conclude y'all's presentation for this morning?
Yes, ma'am, it does. So I have my marching orders about providing some clarity on a few items, particularly around ethics, the topics that Regent Averett brought up on the cooling off period for regents and employment at other vendors. And I believe also including a reference back to the ethics disclosures and policy as part of the digital communications and the social media policy. I have those two as items for me to work with Augie to bring back. That is my concluded comments and presentation for the board on the policy project.
Yes, Chair, and I also have notes of the priority policies that you wanted to bring back and make sure we have in March. So I do have notes on that for the March meeting.
Thank you very much. Regent Averett?
Yes, thank you. Just one last quick question and clarification related to the board committees and the how every 2 years we'll take a look at those. Am I correct in remembering that there is nothing that prevents, though, the chair from appointing an ad hoc committee for a very limited purpose if necessary?
Correct. So the chair or the board by motion can choose to establish additional committees with charges and timeframes at the board's pleasure.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Are there any other general comments or wrap-up questions? Again, policy is the way we do our work, so we are never finished with policy discussions, but for today, are there any additional comments or questions? I want to thank Dan and Tammy for your robust work on this effort, taking our issues and I think listening very carefully to what the board's requests were, coming back with good information and doing the research for us for best practices. Sincerely appreciate the work. And Regents, again, this is methodical work, but it is important work that we all do to make sure that there is clarity in the policy direction that we provide for our staff. So the next item on our agenda is our annual board ethics update. While Mr. Rivera prepares for that, I'm going to let all of us take a break. So if we could come back at 10:35, that'll give us about a 10-minute break, and then we'll come back and finish that training. Thank you.
Thank you, Regent.
Hey, Regents, as you join us, would you turn your cameras back on so we know who is here? Right now we have Regent Averett, Regent Hutchison, Regent Bennett, and Regent Garza. There we go, Dr. Turner. Okay, Dr. Adami is going to be a few minutes late coming back into this session. So I think we have all of the regents who are going to be in attendance for this portion. Augie, if you are there, can you turn on your camera? And there we go.
I'm on. Can everyone see me?
Yes, sir.
Okay, are we ready to proceed, Madam Chair?
Yes.
Okay, good. Well, good morning, everyone. And I want to congratulate you on your hard work this morning. Policy review is always tedious, but most important. And so at the risk of being even more tedious, bear with me. So we're going to do our annual ethics update this morning. For some of you, you've seen this, but it's been at least a couple of years since we were not able to have a full one last year, given the pandemic. And we've got a couple of new board members that I want to introduce to my thoughts about what's important regarding ethics. Now, let me make a distinction right now between your policies and your bylaws. I know you know that, but just to be clear, and I'll be coming back to it at the end, your bylaws are your internal governance document. Operationally, that's where you go to. That's your governing document. It's got your duties and responsibilities set forth, rules for conducting your meetings. It's got your parliamentary authority in there. Of course, college policy has to be consistent with, and to borrow a legal word, it's not just, I know harmony means one thing to Regent Scott, and harmony means another to Regent Hutchison. In the law, you have to have your documents harmonized. And so, like I said, I'll come back to that at the end, but I'm going to be focusing on your bylaws. And so, Ms. Montalvo Cummings, do we have the PowerPoint? I've got a PowerPoint for you, and we're going to be going through some details here. Don't be daunted by the number of slides. I'll tell you now, we're going to go through them fairly quickly.
We are clarifying, Augie, the PowerPoint that you sent. There's a question about one for closed session and one for open session.
Right, this is the board ethics update.
Just 1 second. She's pulling it up.
Sure. I apologize. I should have clarified and confirmed before we got started here.
All right, I think we have found it. I'm watching the communication back and forth between the two IT folks, and I think we're good.
Regent Scott, you had a second calling as a play-by-play announcer, I tell you what. I often say that ethics can be elusive, but I didn't mean it quite like this. So, all right. So there you go. A nice yellow and blue Delmar, gold and blue Delmar colors. So next slide, please. So again, for background, and for some of you, again, you know this, but for the benefit of our new regents, this ethics update that you diligently and faithfully conduct every year, I'm going to tell you now, regents, it's something that I brag about, because you are unique in that respect. Not many boards, from what I've seen, do this, and it came out of back in the fall of 2012 when there was a desire by the board to do a review of its ethics rules and its bylaws, and an ad hoc committee was appointed, and it was chaired by your very own Regent Hutchison, together with Regents Estrada, Rivas, and Watts, and they conducted a review of the board bylaws, specifically the statement of conduct and ethics, and then proposed a few changes that were adopted by the board. But as a result of that work, we now on an annual basis hold this ethics review, which will conclude with each of you signing the Code of Ethics Pledge, which is based on your bylaws and your statement of conduct and ethics, which is a reaffirmation of your commitment to be an ethical regent and trustee. Next slide, please. So I wanted to brag on you all a little bit, because some of you have actually participated in this. I know Regent Scott, you have, and Regent Hutchison, you've had an opportunity to do this as well. But since 2015, a combination of regents, our own college president, and myself have actually appeared on numerous panels and spoken on community college ethics and shared the Delmar experience at the ACCT National Leadership Congress, the AACC conference, and as well as the Texas Association of Community College Attorneys conferences. And so my personal objective is to have every one of you participate in one of these at some point while you sit on the board. I think it's ethical conduct in and of itself to share your experiences and your wisdom and your thoughts with your fellow trustees at all levels, state and national. So I'm very proud of this, and I hope we continue this. 2020, we weren't able to do it given the pandemic, although I know that Regent Scott and Ms. Keys did present on workforce development virtually at the last ACCT conference. And so I think these are great examples of you all giving back and wanting to help. Next slide, please. So why are ethics important? And before I go to that, let me just say this. If it feels a little, if this is going to, I hope this doesn't feel too conceptual, but I'm very mindful of the fact that your bylaws have recently been scrutinized by the ultimate scrutinizer, SACS COC. So they've gone through that and determined that you meet all the accreditation standards. And so I don't want this in any way to suggest that you're deficient in any way, either in your policies, your bylaws, or your practices. But because again, you've been examined, and Dr. Wilson would want me to say that. But still, as you'll hear me say, I mean, I think ethics are important on an ongoing basis, and it's something that you should always evaluate and reevaluate. So this is why ethics are important. Next slide, please. So these are real headlines that I always like to quote, and some of you have seen these before. But so what happens when you're not ethical is you end up in the news, and you end up in a headline. And you can see some of these. What you don't want to do is have a headline that Delmar College has in its board has violated ethics rules. Next slide, please. So there you go. There's additional headlines. I mean, the one I always like to point out is that grand jury expected to urge community college ethics panel. So things were so bad that a grand jury actually felt like the issue was so egregious, the violation was so egregious that they wanted to recommend the formation of an ethics panel. Okay, so next slide. more importantly, and this is something I'll tie in at the end, but I believe that ethics provide the board with a moral compass. And you'll hear this cited in a bit, that the laws are in some ways easy. Your conflicts of interest law, your Texas Open Meetings Act laws, I mean, those are to a large extent black and white. I can show that to you, and you know what you can do and what you cannot do. Ethics so many times involve what you ought to do, and that sometimes gets a little difficult and elusive, but let me see if I can help you out with that. So next slide, please. I wanted to start off with a couple of quotes. The first is my favorite from one of my political heroes, the Honorable Barbara Jordan. And Congresswoman Jordan said, there is nothing complicated or difficult about ethics. It's about values. It's about right and wrong behavior. It's about the common good, the good we all hold in common. Ethical behavior means being honest, telling the truth, and doing what you said you would do. This quote is so profound that the Office of General Counsel for the University of Texas system has it on their webpage as their North Star for talking about ethics. Next slide. Some of you know Dr. George Boggs. I know that for Dr. Scamia and some of the other administrators, Dr. Silva, I mean, you are all very familiar with Dr. Boggs. He's the dean of community colleges, one of the deans, I guess, on the national level, and is no question seen as a moral authority when it comes to all things community colleges. And so I've got a few quotes from him where he talks about what leadership means. It's a privilege that enables the leader to impact both organizations and the lives of people, but it carries responsibilities. The most important one is for anyone in a position of influence is to honor the public trust. Next slide. He observes that community colleges, for all the good that they do, exhibit the same type of lapses in ethics that we find throughout society. Why do they continue to occur? What can be done to strengthen the ethical foundations of our institutions? Next slide. He's got a pretty simple blueprint. He says, restoring public confidence can only happen if we begin to make ethical behavior a significant value, especially for leaders in our institutions and organizations. It is important to think seriously about ethical values before one is faced with difficult and ambiguous dilemmas that are all too common. Ethics statements do not guarantee ethical behavior, but they do serve to remind leaders that ethical considerations should guide their behavior. So I would submit to you, Regents, that Del Mar College and its board has very much made ethical behavior a significant value. That's why I went through the history of what you've done in practice, not just what you say. The fact, again, that you hold this ethics update every year, I believe, demonstrates to the public, to the community, to our Del Mar family, as well as the community at large, that ethical behavior is a significant value here at Del Mar. The fact that you're thinking seriously by holding this update on an annual basis, you're following Dr. Boggs' advice. And finally, the fact that you take very seriously the statements that you have, your official statements and your bylaws, and as evidenced by your policy work this morning, shows that you very much are concerned and care about what ethical considerations should guide your behavior. Next slide, please. So from all of these conversations that we've been having on an ongoing basis at the national and state level, we've kind of developed the following best practices for better ethics. Develop ethics statement and code of ethics that apply to your duties and responsibilities and incorporate them into your board bylaws and college policy. Include a formal process for addressing unethical conduct by a board member and what board action is authorized. Also, to review your board bylaws and college policy on a regular basis. Next slide. Ensure that every new board member is provided with a new member orientation that also includes ethics training. Conduct a regular board ethics update. Consider having board members affirmatively recommit themselves to the highest ethical standards. Address ethical violations swiftly and decisively, and conduct an annual or regular evaluation of the college president and the board. So again, these board members, these are best practices that I've developed with others that I've worked with from other community colleges in these presentations, and I'm happy to say that I'm always proud to tell the audience that we're speaking to that at Del Mar College we do each and every one of these things, and so you are following the best practices that we've been able to come up with. Okay, next slide. ACCT, which provides you with a lot of guidance and information on how to conduct yourselves as community college regents, as well as how to help Del Mar College, says this is their policy statement, that governing boards function best when the ethical standards for trustee behavior are clear. They recommend that all boards adopt a set of standards, often called a code of ethics or standards for good practice. Some regional community college accrediting commissions require that you have a code of ethics or similar statement in place. SAC-COC, by the way, no surprise, does require such a code of ethics, and again, you can check that box because you have that. Now, you may be sitting there at this point and saying, well, Augie, of course, this is all, this is all old hat, or of course we have this. Well, it's interesting because I generally start off presentations by asking those in the audience who come from community colleges around the United States and other jurisdictions, from the Mariana Islands and Guam. I mean, you've got people from all over, your fellow trustees that attend ACCT conferences. And I always start off by asking them, how many of you know whether or not you have a code of ethics? Show of hands. And it's generally a pretty honest group, and not everybody raises their hands. Okay, so I mean, despite the fact that I'm sure that all accrediting agencies require you to have this in place, there are those who don't, or who don't know whether they have it or not. And if they do, then I'll ask, okay, for those of you that do, when was the last time you looked at it? When was the last time you looked at it as a board? And so many times these become, shelf documents and not actual living documents. And kudos to you, Regents, for keeping up to date on this and meeting all best practices. Next slide, please. So the primary sources of ethics rules for you are found in your bylaws, particularly the Statement of Conduct and Ethics, in your policy, and you talked about that this morning, and some of the suggested tweaks and changes that you're going to be making to that. The Code of Ethics form that you sign annually, and then state law that covers things like reporting guidelines, conflicts of interest, and all. We're going to focus this morning on your bylaws. Next slide, please. So again, you are all familiar with this, and for our newest regents, I can say that we went over these, and so that this is familiar to them as well. But just to make sure that we all read these again together and understand what they say. And how they fit into the bigger picture. This is the preamble. This starts with each member of the board will strive to support the mission statement of the college, and to that end shall adhere to the following standards. Next slide. Attend and participate actively in regularly scheduled board meetings insofar as possible, and become well informed concerning issues to be considered at those meetings. I will say that the black and white rule is that you must make at least 50% of your meetings on an annual basis. Otherwise, you are by statute subject to being removed. Next, work with other board members to establish effective board policies. This morning is an example of you doing that. Delegate authority for the administration of the college to the president of the college, and act on behalf of the board only with the official authorization of a majority of the members of the board. Next slide. So beware of micromanagement. I've covered this, board members, in meetings past, and we've talked about that. And if you've attended at least one ACCT conference, then you've been cautioned against micromanaging. And so we always go back to the principle of accreditation that SAC-COC has in there, and it's 4.2b. There must be a clear and appropriate distinction in writing and practice between the policymaking functions of the governing board and the responsibility of the administration and faculty to administer and implement policy. So SAC-COC looked, investigated, examined, looked at all the information we provided. They looked at your board minutes. They had interviews, and they came away giving you a clean bill of health on this one. Del Mar College does not micromanage, because if you did, you would have shown up on a list, and I've seen that list, and Dr. Wilson can tell you about that list, and it's for colleges that have issues, and this comes up. This comes up when the board is getting too involved in the daily operations, bypassing and undermining the president and CEO of the college and trying to run the college themselves. So again, congratulations on not being micromanagers. Next slide, please. Going on next to your other additional duties, you make policy decisions only after full discussion at publicly held board meetings. You render all decisions based on the available facts, independent judgment, refuse to surrender that judgment to individuals or special interest groups, and abide by and uphold the final majority decision of the board. That last sentence is one that we'll cover in a bit again, but I think Regent Averett alluded to this earlier, or made mention of this earlier, and I know you all understand this, you've all read this, but I just want to put an emphasis on it. It's so important. It's so important just in terms of how you operate, your credibility as a board, the college's credibility at large, that the board be seen to respect each other by, you may have a discussion and you can have a heated debate. That's okay. That's democracy at work at the most local level. But at the end of the day, when a majority of you decide to go one way, then that's the decision of the board, and every member of the board should uphold that and support that. Next slide, please. So Del Mar College has a free speech policy and has always adhered to the principles of free speech and academic freedom. And in that regard, you are all encouraged to freely express your opinion, to seek systematic communications between the board and students, faculty, staff, and the community, while refraining. Here's the caveat: from communicating with students, staff, faculty, and the community in any way which could be interpreted as having any authority outside the meetings of the board, and refraining from any communications among a quorum of board members outside of the board meeting. This is to say, and you've heard me caution you before, that certainly I'm not saying that you should not have the ability to communicate with members of the college community, family, or staff, students, faculty, but you need to be very careful when you do that. And as I've cautioned you before, you don't want to get drawn into an issue that could compromise you as a board member, and also you don't want to communicate in a way that is confusing or giving off the impression that you are acting on behalf of the board or authorized by the board or acting on behalf of Del Mar College. Regents, some of you know, and for the benefit of our newer regents, that was an issue that came up that you all had to deal with several years ago with a board member, where there were public communications that were giving off an impression that perhaps this was something that had been authorized or sanctioned by the board when it wasn't. So it's a fine line, Regents, because I think the safer assumption is for you all to always assume that you've got your Regents hat on. That's certainly how the public views you, 99, if not 100% of the time. So again, in your public communications, you need to be careful about that. Next slide, please. You're expected to communicate to other board members as well as the president, CEO of the college, public reaction to board policies and college programs. And you are to work with other board members and with the president in a spirit of harmony and cooperation in a manner that creates and sustains mutual respect. So I've had the privilege of serving Del Mar College since 2005. as its counsel, and I've worked with many boards and many board members. And I would say that this board has always consistently met that ethical aspirational goal. This board has always worked with each other and with the college president, and I would say in a spirit of harmony and cooperation, and you have each other's mutual respect, and I'm sure that will continue. Next slide, please. You have an ethical duty to become informed about current educational issues by individual study and through participation in programs providing the needed information, such as those sponsored by state and national community college organizations, and I referred to a couple of them earlier. You are to support the employment of those persons best qualified to serve as college faculty and staff, insist on a regular and impartial evaluation of all faculty and staff, and respect the authority and responsibilities of college employees and external contractors to empower them to work without interference. Now, I do not take this, and it should not be interpreted as saying that you handle the employment of persons that serve as college faculty and staff. That is the college president's province, but you certainly support and back up the college president by complying with this particular section. Next slide, please. Regent Averett, you were talking about this. This is in your bylaws. You mentioned the confidentiality earlier, and absolutely, you should respect the confidentiality of information that is privileged under applicable law, including all deliberations of the board in closed session. And you should remember always that the first and greatest concern must be the educational welfare of the students attending the college. Frankly, that holds true for all of us, right? Anyone who is associated with Del Mar College at every level, but beginning with you on the board as our leadership. We should always remember that it is the educational welfare of the students and our students that we care for first. Next slide. You should, in the way it's currently stated, you should engage in no activity that could create a conflict of interest. You should refrain from using the board position for personal or partisan gain. Next slide. You should bring about desired changes through legal and ethical procedures, upholding and enforcing all applicable statutes, regulations, and court decisions pertaining to community colleges. Should work with other board members to establish effective policies and practices, and prohibiting unlawful discrimination, including conduct that constitutes sexual harassment. Next slide. You should refrain from any attempt to influence any operational decision, including but not limited to individual admissions, personnel, or purchasing decisions, except when such is an issue at a board meeting. And no board member shall have any communications about a grievance with any person with a pending grievance. Identify and disclose any actual or potential conflict of interest and act for the general public good, regardless of personal relationships or business interests. So those are your bylaws as you have them, currently stated. You've covered a lot of this in your policy talk this morning, but we have some work to do in like I say, harmonizing the bylaws and making sure that they're consistent with the policy recommendations that are going to be made. I do have the next series of slides. I'm going to go through them rather quickly because again, for Regent Gottison, Regent Turner, they haven't seen this particular presentation before, but I go to a particular handbook, and Regents, again, most of you are familiar with this. I've talked about this before. The Community College League of California has an amazing trustee handbook. It's over 150 pages long. And it is chock full of very helpful information. Now, a lot of the stuff wouldn't be pertinent to you because it has to do with California state law and those laws that apply to the regents and the board, and different conflicts of interest rules and reporting requirements and all of that. But their ethics section, the reason I cite this time and again, and I use this in my presentations, is because it is bar none the gold standard. It is the best, well-written, clear, coherent explanation of what good ethical standards are. I mean, that's why I have it cited verbatim, and I will go through it and not force you to have me read every single thing here, but I've quoted it almost in whole cloth because it is that good, and I couldn't do justice saying it. I mean, if I said it, I think you would all say, well, that's Augie saying it, and I just want you to see what really good writing, really good thought, and really good practical advice looks like. And I'll give a shout out to, she's retired, but Dr. Cindra Smith was forever the executive director of the Community College League, and she's responsible for this. And I've never met her, but they've done some great work here. Even, so this is found in the section talking about an effective board, and they talk about the ethics and laws with this prefatory language. Trustees and governing boards have the responsibility to be both ethical and legal. Ethics are standards of right and wrong, good and bad. Ethics address what one ought to do to fulfill one's moral duty. Being legal means complying with the laws and regulations that apply to college boards and elected officials. Ethics refers to moral responsibilities and may go beyond legal considerations. Being ethical and legal involves more than understanding what the right thing is to do. It means that one must perform in ethical and legal ways. One must actively walk the talk. First, one determines what is right or wrong, good or bad. Then one does what is right, good, and required by law. Next slide. I'll just summarize this, but I mean, this talks about the establishing of codes of ethics, and they refer there to the Western Association Accrediting Commission for junior and community colleges, and they also require them to have a code of ethics. And so I just wanted to read to you the last couple of sentences at the bottom where they talk about the codes of ethics. Your codes of ethics put in writing the oughts are, what the oughts are of trusteeship. They usually address board roles and responsibilities and trustee conduct. And I will say that yours do fit that bill. Obviously they do, because Sachs gave you a check mark on that. But let's go through a few of these from the CCL, from the Community College League Handbook. Next slide, please. So board roles. Next slide. Representing the common good. They explain there that governing boards derive their authority from and are accountable to the community as a whole. As public officials, trustees fulfill the core value of responsibility by acting on behalf of the entire community. They express the value of benevolence by seeking the well-being of the entire community. They represent the interests of the community in their board decisions. Representing the common good. Next slide. Student success. Your job is to educate students and to produce people who contribute to society. You should be expected to uphold the welfare and success of students as a primary concern and expect themselves to focus on mission and goals of the college in their meetings. You all do this. Student success is always the top of your list. So you're doing this very well. Next slide. We've talked about this, and this continues to be important. And it's important because I know you all can read this and you all understand this, and I don't mean to be condescending at all, but it is, as often as we can read this, it remains the fact that every day there are boards that do not act as a unit. And so it begins with the basic recognition that your governing authority rests with the entire board, not with any individual trustee. You don't have authority to direct staff, determine programs, or represent the college on your own, and ethical trustees do not try to do so. Regent Scott said this morning, this very thing, that your voice is expressed through the policies that you have as well as the actions you take in your official meetings. again, here it is. Once the board has decided a policy or position, a trustee must be prepared to support it publicly. It is unethical to try to use authority independently from the board to speak out against or to try to sabotage a board decision. That goes back to the mutual respect. This is already in your bylaws. Next slide, please.
I'm going to have you
This,
pause. I'm going to have you
Yes.
pause. Regent Averett has a question or comment.
Sure, I'm sorry, and I should have made that clear that you can ask questions at any time. I'm sorry, you look really small but yes, Regent.
Thank you so much. And really, as somebody who is, well, I personally have not run for office before. Let me put it that way. And so my question is, while I certainly understand the need for us to act as a whole and support decisions, even if it wasn't my personal preference, how does a regent who does decide to run for office, how do we thread that needle of being respectful to the whole of the board while having every right and I believe duty to say to the public, this is what we decided. However, personally, that's not the direction I supported. How do you do that so that our constituents have an accurate view of who we are and what we believe while not violating these kinds of very, very good standards?
That's a very, very good question. The snide answer is, or the flippant answer, you do it very carefully, but that's not what you're asking me. You should be able to publicly state your disagreement with an action of the board. And I would submit, though, that that has to be followed up with, if you are still on the board and want to be on the board, that you explain that as, however, despite the fact that I didn't agree with it, a majority of the board did. And I'm duty bound to support that, and I will. I think that's the only way that you can do it. But this is an open mic, board members. If anyone feels differently, that's just my opinion. I'm not on the board, you are, but that's how I would approach it. If one of you were to ask me, I don't agree with this, but I want to be able to tell the public that I didn't agree with that. But I don't think you can say one without bringing up the other part that you are going to respect the board's decision and move forward to support it.
Yeah, I always think that, especially like on social media, I think it's like, this is my opinion, not the board's opinion. And I think we just have to personalize ourselves and just make sure it's very clear with any public comments that this is my opinion, even though the board went a different direction. And so I don't know, isn't that right? That's what we do at the state level.
Regent, I think that's correct. I think, and it's going to be a matter of degrees, right? You can state that you didn't agree with something, but at what point do you begin to actively advocate against the position taken by the board, or are you taking actions that are organizing, an effort to go against the board? It's hard to think about it in the abstract for me, but there is always that risk that by making your position known, to the extent it was contrary to the board, that it be misinterpreted or seen as trying to undermine or go against, in an active way, after the board vote, against what the board did.
Mr. Rivera,
Yes, sir.
would there be any difference if the board had voted on something prior to your becoming a member?
I think so. I think that's a fair distinction. If something were voted on before you got on the board, but again, I think the bottom line on all this, I think, is to be transparent and open. Again, explaining I wasn't on the board, so I didn't weigh in on this particular proposal. I wouldn't have been in favor of it. I don't believe gives one carte blanche to then come in and say, so I'm going to rally against it now. I think it remains a decision of the board that you joined. And so in some respects, I would say you know, it's not, you can say I didn't vote for it, but it is the action, the prior action of the board that you now sit on. And I think, you're duty bound to respect it.
Thank you.
Yes, but it comes down to communication. As Regent Turner pointed out, and I think others of you pointed out, you just have to be very clear in your public statements. You know, whether you're saying them as a board member or as a you know, your own personal opinion. And I say the real sticky part, it's very difficult to navigate, folks. And I think it's always safe to assume that the public always views you as a regent of Del Mar College. And if you keep that in mind, then you're going to be consistent in how you speak publicly. I think it's a very fine line. And to Regent David's point, I think it's a very difficult needle to thread to say, well, let me take off my regent hat and put on my personal hat. And you know, I think that's very hard to do. Okay, next slide, please. This one's a little long, but I think it's important. Single and special interest groups play an important role in representing various segments of our diverse society, such as political parties, racial and ethnic groups, employee associations, religious groups, neighborhood associations, taxpayer groups. Now, while all of these interests are important, trustees must remember that the first and foremost obligation of every trustee is to represent the general interests of the college's service area. Ethical behavior involves being aware of a wide variety of public and community needs and integrating them into the interests of the whole. So you may have a particular personal affiliation with any number of groups. I mean, as spelled out in this particular section. But when you're on the Del Mar board, you should all be acting together, looking at the best interests of the college as a whole, and making decisions based on that. Next slide, please. Board responsibilities include establishing policies that direct the operations of the college and that assure that the college is performing according to those policies. Ethical trustees engage wisely in policy making and respect the delegation of authority of the chief executive administrator of the college. Problems occur when boards and trustees become involved in the day-to-day operations and try to second guess or direct staff activities. Although often well-intentioned, these acts are disrespectful of the college and the chief executive. They're more than disrespectful. They could potentially get you into trouble with SACS, COC, because you're micromanaging, and beyond that. And again, I'm speaking from experience. I'm speaking from experience. Believe me when I say that getting too involved in day-to-day operations sometimes earn you an invitation to testify in a lawsuit. And that's not anything that any of you would ever want to do. So I'm here to try to help you from going there, because that's not fun. So, but it's more than disrespect, although that's important. It also leads to other complications. Okay, next slide.
Mr. Rivera, if I might just jump in here, that does not preclude regents from informing the CEO if they see or become aware of or are communicated with about a student issue or a physical plant issue or anything like that. So you can certainly be the eyes and ears and communicate that information to the CEO. The fine line becomes when you try to then direct the CEO on how to solve that problem. So
That's
I just
right.
wanted to make that clear.
Thank you, Regent Scott. You're exactly right. You're exactly right. In fact, I would say that you have a duty and responsibility to give the CEO, college president, a heads up if you see or hear something. And if it's something you hear about something that's going on in the college, I mean, that's exactly right. But that's, the duty to inform and notify, that's where it ends. You don't take action on your own, and you don't direct a college president on how to handle it. But thank you for clarifying that. That's actually an affirmative duty, I think, on you to keep the college president, CEO informed of what you're hearing out there. Okay, a few slides, and I didn't put everything in here, but just from some of these big sections, I have a few slides for you, and this has to do under trustee conduct. Next slide, please. Civility, decorum, and consideration for others. Remaining courteous and open-minded, and treating others with honesty, decency, and respect are characteristic of ethical trustees. Ethical trustees practice responsible self-restraint and set a good example for others by communicating thoughtfully and representing the college well in their interactions with others. They avoid bitter arguments, and they use courteous, non-inflammatory language at board meetings. I can't resist, because we don't operate in a vacuum. We're all in this boat, but we're also part of a bigger boat. And I would submit to you that things that are going on in Washington, D.C. right now, not being political at all, but I don't know that there's a whole lot of civility, decorum, and consideration for others. I use that only as an illustrative example to point out that the reason this is important is really not just so that you can be nice to each other, but because the community and the public at large is watching. They're watching how you interact with each other, how you handle debate, how you handle votes, and you've always got to be mindful of that. And I'm a big believer in like I said earlier, you need to walk the talk. You need to do this because it goes to leadership, and it goes to ethical leadership. Next slide. Following right up on this, so consideration for others means speaking well of others in public. Criticizing or belittling other trustees, college staff, or community members hurts the reputation of the entire board, and I would add, it hurts the reputation of the entire college. So you are Del Mar College, ladies and gentlemen. When you are out in public, you are seen as Del Mar College. How you conduct yourselves with respect to each other, what you say is something that goes directly to the reputation that you're going to have. The next slide. This addresses the board CEO college president relationship. Respect, reliability, trustworthiness, and justice are all key values in the board CEO relationship. Those are some pretty heavy words. Respect, reliability, trustworthiness, I get, but they put in there justice. And I tend to agree with that. You need to be absolutely fair with each other. It's a two-way street. Specific ethical concepts include committing to thoughtful, thorough CEO search processes, fair and attractive contracts, no surprises. That means you should never keep anything from each other where it ends up blowing up and being a surprise, and clear differentiation of roles, delegation, and direction. Next slide. Open communication. All board members, as well as the CEO, are responsible for maintaining an open, cooperative environment and promoting a free exchange of information at the board meetings. Trustee deliberations are characterized by fairness and open and impartial processes for gathering and evaluating information. Trustees are honest and straightforward in civil and respectful ways. Next slide. Following up on communication. So the board and CEO should discuss and reach agreement on protocols for trustee contact with other college administrators, faculty, and classified staff members. Ethical trustees support the authority of the CEO position and respect established lines of communication. Student and employee complaints to trustees should be referred directly through appropriate channels or to the chief executive officer. Every community college has or should have procedures that provide for fair treatment of students or employees. We've talked about this before, and the way you do it, you have all you communicate with the college CEO, the college president. You don't directly contact other college administrators, faculty, or staff members. You go through the CEO for any communications with the college, and that goes for complaints that you may receive. You again refer them through the college president. Every community college should have procedures, and you do. You have procedures that provide for procedures and policies, frankly, that provide for fair treatment of students and employees. And again, my job is to help you avoid getting entangled in any of those ongoing processes. Going on with communication, next slide, please. So, codes of ethics may include statements about protocols for communicating with community members and media personnel. They usually state, and I wanted to point this out again. Remember where we are. This is from what I consider to be the gold standard. From, I think there's a lot of wisdom in this, and a lot of pragmatic wisdom, frankly. The protocols usually state that individual trustees do not speak for the board unless specifically delegated to do so, and refer and or follow up with community members through appropriate channels. These protocols ensure reliability of information and respect the board as a unit and the roles of those designated as spokespeople for the college. Your practice has been time and again, board members, that board statements are usually made by the board chair. The board chair speaks on behalf of the board. Sometimes it's the college president. In sensitive matters, which is rare, but there are times when the general counsel will make a statement for the college. College relations is plugged into this all the time, at all levels, and helping and assisting. But again, ordinarily you are not. There's the standard operating procedure has been for the board chair to serve as the spokesperson for the board. Next slide, please. Functioning as a team member. You all know you're part of a team. And as it says there, board members differ in personality, motivation, knowledge, attitude, experience, background, community stature, and capability. I would add this: while you may differ in so many different ways, in a number of ways, I know that each and every one of you is committed to the same thing, and that's serving Del Mar College. The fact that you're different, or that come with different points of view, is not a bad thing. I mean, as you can see here, different points of view help develop alternatives, stimulate the imagination, and lead to creative solutions. Again, the key is being open and respectful of each other. Trustees often bring specialized knowledge to the board by virtue of their backgrounds and professions. However, trustees are not on the board to be experts in their fields. They are there to represent broad community interests and do not play other roles while acting as a trustee. So if I may pick on Regent Hutchison, and I do so endearingly, Regent Hutchison. She is one of the most talented, brilliant lawyers I've ever met. And while she may have insight and provide input to you on a legal matter, which I would be listening and taking notes to, she would be the first to tell you, but I'm not the lawyer. I'm not acting as the board's lawyer here. And I think that's important. I mean, I think you all have expertise and specialized skills that you bring. You have tremendous skill sets that you bring to the table. But at the end of the day, you're there, as it says, to represent broad community interests and to act as a board member. That's your role. So, next slide. Regent, here it is again. So even California Community College League, emphasizes maintaining confidentiality. While most of what you do is public, an important aspect of trustee ethics is maintaining confidentiality about issues discussed in closed session. Violating confidentiality occurs when individuals share closed session information, such as informing the union of the collective bargaining position. We don't have a union, you don't have that issue, but still, nonetheless, or when information is leaked to the media, or when private personnel matters are discussed. again, I will say that can be truly devastating when confidential information is shared or leaks out in some way. I can say many years ago, I'm trying to remember now whether any of you were even on the board. I don't believe so, but we've seen what happens when confidential information is let out, and even inadvertently. It's one of the reasons that I'm always careful with how I provide you with the information in closed session, because particularly now in the age of emails, right, and electronic information, I mean, things can easily get slipped or emailed to the wrong person, and we've got to be very careful of that. But when I say devastating, not only can you perhaps compromise a sensitive issue, but it could also lead to further legal consequences if confidential information is leaked. So that's why we're very careful with that. And I always say this, I believe in open government, and I know all of you do as well. And the fact, for example, that you're doing this transparently out in the open, when it could be presented to you as legal advice in closed session, the fact that you want your community to see what you're doing here, I think speaks volumes about your commitment to open government and transparency. But there are exceptions to the Texas Open Meetings Act. There are exceptions to what can be produced or what has to be disclosed in response to a public information request. And those exceptions are important. And one of them is when information is confidential. So I will continue to try to help you maintain confidentiality of those things that need to remain confidential. Okay, next one. You all know about this. What you do is time consuming. I get it. And so let me use this opportunity to make a personal statement here and just say thank you. Thank each and every one of you for complying with this aspirational ethical standard. There's no question that each and every one of you shows commitment. And that's what it takes. Number one, to learn about what you do as trustees, and to learn about the college, and to learn about the weighty decisions that you're being asked to make at a board meeting. Lots of time, lots of effort, and lots of thought. And I know each and every one of you complies with it. Every time you go through your board packet and you're ready, and your deliberations show that. So thank you for showing commitment. But that's a part of being ethical. Okay, last few slides. Last section that I borrowed from the handbook has to do with dilemmas and unethical conduct. Next slide, please. I referred to when we started with the statement that ethics can sometimes be elusive, and that's because they're not, as it says here, living by ethical standards is not always easy. Everyone may be seduced at times into being less than he or she can be due to self-interest or the perceived need to advance a single interest, or the difficulty of fully respecting those with whom one disagrees. And boards may be faced with ethical dilemmas and conflicting values. Ethical dilemmas can occur in boards when one ethical course of action may mean that another ethical value is not upheld. Resolving these dilemmas requires board members to engage in often very difficult discussions to determine which ethical values are most important in a specific situation. The criteria for decision-making often are those which uphold the public good and what is best for the community and a college as a whole. Again, your North Star should be what upholds the public good and what is best for the community and college as a whole. Next slide. Unethical trustee behavior includes many activities, such as independently pursuing pet projects, breaking confidentiality, or not devoting time to the role. These activities hurt the college. Unethical trustee behavior can lead to loss of public support. It has caused problems in the reaccreditation process. Community members and legislators lose faith in the college and may be more reluctant to support funding for the institution. Trustees who act unethically fail to fulfill their fiduciary responsibility to protect the value of the college. Any questions about any of those? Again, ethical principles, standards. A lot of them, sound familiar. I'm sure this handbook elaborates on some of these a little more than your board bylaws do. But I also like to show you just to show that the board bylaws that you have are consistent with what others say. Your board bylaws should look like. Okay. Last couple of slides. The next one is just very fine print, but what I'm going to do after this, Regents, look for your email because I will be sending you your code of ethics form. The fact that you've stuck with me up to this point it means that you have successfully completed this year's ethics update and review. And again, these are the 11 points that are consistent with and modeled on your policies and bylaws. Read them, and then if you could sign the form and scan it and send it back to me, or put it in the mail. I keep them in a folder here for after we complete this. But any questions on any of these items?
Augie, this is Mark.
Yes, sir.
Just really quickly on a little technical piece, we might be able to complete and/or compile the signatures via DocuSign. Just a little technical
Sure.
piece. So just
Okay.
we have those capabilities, and so just FYI there. So there's no scanning and all of those sorts of things.
Very well. Thank you. We'll upgrade that and get that for ease of completion here. But you can see them. I mean, again, these are all pretty much modeled on what you do. Regent Hutchison may remember this, but this came out of, again, also the ad hoc committee that reviewed the bylaws, and this was something that we borrowed from another college. Frankly, another community college had this and found it, liked it, and have adopted it. And I'm very proud of the fact that you guys sign this every year. Next slide, please. So I've been reading a book, and I don't know, some of you may have seen this, Sailing True North, 10 Admirals in the Voyage of Character, and it's written by retired Admiral James Stavridis, who is very well regarded, and it's a book about 10 naval admirals who throughout history who demonstrated extreme character. I won't go through the book. I recommend it to you, but I did want to leave you with this final thought towards the end of the book. He says, final thought that can help illuminate character as you understand it. Who are your heroes? And he advises everyone to go through a little exercise. List who your ethical heroes are, what qualities you find admirable about them, and then whether you live up to those standards yourself. But he's very clear, and I wanted to read this passage to you. He makes the distinction between resume values and eulogy values. And if you'll bear with me, I'll just read this final paragraph to you. A final thought that can help illuminate character as you understand it. Who are your heroes? Ideally, they are people you deeply admire for reasons that stem not from their accomplishments, what David Brooks in The Road to Character has called resume virtues, but rather from their character values, which he calls eulogy virtues, as in the things people will hopefully say about you at your funeral. Our resume virtues are the schools we attend, the grades we get, the prizes we win, the salaries we earn, the houses we buy, the books we write. Our eulogy virtues are the qualities we embody. And in the case of the principal ones discussed in this book, they include honesty, justice, humor, creativity, balance, empathy, humility, and resilience. Next slide. And with that, Regents, I'm open for any questions and then a humble recommendation. But I want to see if you have any questions first.
Questions or comments from the board? Regent Averett.
And again, I can't.
I want to make sure Can y'all hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. I want to make sure that I understood something correctly. You mentioned at the beginning that we had an ad hoc bylaws committee in the fall of 2012. And so has the board not reviewed, obviously we're reviewing policies right now, but has the board not reviewed the bylaws or our code of ethics statements since 2012?
Other than going through them on an annual basis like this, where we review them, in the update, there hasn't been a comprehensive review or studying of the bylaws like we did in 2012. And Regent Avery, that was going to be my recommendation because it's tied in. Like I said, we've got policies that are being proposed that you all discussed this morning, and so we have. Regent Scott, the board, we're going to have to harmonize and make sure that the policies are in sync with your board bylaws, and so that could be done through an ad hoc committee that might help the work. Because I think board input is important, given that we're talking about the bylaws. So that's my humble suggestion, but again,
Yes, I think I agree. I brought it up with Regent Scott a few weeks ago when I was reading through the bylaws that I think it's time that we kind of do a comprehensive look. Times have changed, society needs have changed, and our board dynamics are changing too. So it's been since 2012, so I agree. I think we should take a deeper dive again.
Thank you all for that. And obviously that was part of the policy work has bled over a little bit into the board bylaws as it relates to the ethics statement. But we'll take that into consideration and look at the parameters for an ad hoc committee to do that, to look at the complete set of bylaws as it relates to our current policy development, and then any future amendments to that as well. Thank you.
thank you. With that, Madam Chair, I'm done with this update. I hope you all enjoyed it. Like I said, every time you go through it, particularly in light of the fact that you were actually going through granular policy review this morning and looking at details, you have a little more context now. I mean, maybe some of these things that you've heard and listened to before made a little more practical sense. But it's always good to review and to talk about ethics. And I thank you for your attention this morning.
Thank you, Mr. Rivera. With that, not seeing any other mics open for questions or comments, then I am considering it's 11:42. We are going to adjourn adjourn our workshop session of the board, and we reconvene at 1 p.m. for our regular meeting. Thank you all very much. We are adjourned at 11:43 a.m.